few housekeeping items. All attendees are going to be muted during the presentation. You can submit your questions for our presenters by typing them into the question section of your panel. It should be on the right-hand side of your computer screen. I'll ask these questions out loud to our presenters after they finish their presentations. If you're having any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar support directly. They can be reached at 1-800-263-6317. Now I will turn it over to Erica Fine, WAN's Nuclear Weapons Policy Director, for introductions. Erica?
Thanks so much, Abdi, and thank you to Kelsey Davenport and Jamal Abdi for joining us today and presenting on this webinar. We're really excited to be able to present today to you all. There's a lot to cover, so I'll be keeping the introductions brief. Our two speakers will discuss the status of the negotiations and what's happening in Congress. But I just want to give a little context about why this international issue is so important to WAN. There are two main reasons. One, we want to see a deal that makes it as difficult as possible for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon because we care about preventing the spread of these weapons. WAN believes nuclear weapons are a threat to our very existence, and we work not just to prevent the global spread, but to reduce our arsenal here in the United States. And reason number two, the stakes are high. Hawks and extremists in all camps are hoping that negotiations fail and that the sides default back to the status quo. But that gambit is dangerous. Many of you will recall times when various U.S. politicians or academics called for bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. That talk has ratcheted down now since the opening of these negotiations, but a U.S.-led war would be disastrous for humanitarian and geopolitical reasons alike. So we need to do everything we can to prevent a war, and that means forcefully supporting diplomacy. Now I'll introduce our speakers. Kelsey Davenport, who you will hear from first, is the Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. In addition to her focus on the Iran nuclear issues, Kelsey provides research and analysis on the nuclear and missile programs in North Korea, India, and Pakistan, and on nuclear security issues. Kelsey also reports on developments in these areas for Arms Control Today. Kelsey joined the Arms Control Association in August 2011 as the Herbert Scovel Jr. Peace Fellow. Second, you'll hear from Jamal Abdi, Policy Director at the National Iranian American Council. Jamal joined NIAC in November 2009, directing NIAC's efforts to monitor policies and legislation and to educate and advocate on behalf of the Iranian American community. Jamal joined NIAC's team following his role as policy advisor to Representative Brian Baird. As one of a small number of Iranian Americans working on the Hill, he served as a congressional advisor liaison and expert on foreign affairs, immigration, and defense. And now I will turn it over to Kelsey to begin.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And thank you so much to WAN for having me and to all of the people who have tuned in to this webinar. I look forward to your questions at the end of the session. First, though, to really understand the significance of the current moment in international relations with Iran and the possibility for getting a nuclear deal, we need to look back to the past and see sort of the trajectory of Iran's nuclear program over the past decade. Really dating back to 2003, the international community has been trying to negotiate an agreement with Iran that would limit its nuclear program. But those efforts until November of 2013 were largely unsuccessful. And as those negotiations continued, Iran was increasing its nuclear capacity. As you can see from the chart here, just over the past few years, these lines indicate how Iran was installing sort of more and more centrifuges. And by the time we reached an agreement, Iran's nuclear program had nearly doubled in terms of its capacity since 2010. Iran was also building up its stockpiles of enriched uranium. You can see here on this chart, Iran began enriching uranium to a higher level in May of 2010, enrichment up to 20%. And this level is was of a particular concern to the international community because it can be much more easily turned into weapons-grade uranium, which is enriched to greater than 90%. And if you see here this green line from August of 2013, Iran's enrichment to 20%, this is the 20% stockpile that it kept on hand, was nearing 200 kilograms. And about at 225 to 240 kilograms is when when Netanyahu said that Israel would consider bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. So taken together, Iran was moving closer and closer to what we call a quick breakout to nuclear weapons, meaning that they would be able to develop the fissile material for a nuclear weapon before the IAEA could quickly detect and the international community could disrupt that process. So we're at a very, very critical stage. But then in 2013, a new Iranian president was elected, Hassan Rouhani, and he indicated a willingness to negotiate and to be more transparent about the nuclear program. And the results since then have been quite dramatic. In November of 2013, Iran and the P5+1, so that's China, France, Germany, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, signed an interim nuclear agreement called the Joint Plan of Action. And for the first time in over a decade, Iran's progress on its nuclear program was halted, and the most proliferation-sensitive elements were rolled back. I just talked about the importance of the 20% enrichment. Iran agreed under the Joint Plan of Action to halt enrichment to 20% and neutralize that stockpile that was of such a concern to the international community. They also froze the number of centrifuges that were operating and agreed not to install any new centrifuges. They committed to halt work at the Iraq heavy water reactor, which is under construction, which had been under construction, and the international community was concerned that that reactor would produce plutonium that could also be used for nuclear weapons. And perhaps even more importantly, Iran agreed to increased inspections, and this included daily access to the places where Iran was enriching uranium, the enrichment plants at Natanz and Fordo. So any deviation from this agreement would be detected by the International Atomic Energy Agency immediately because of this increased access, this increased monitoring and verification. And then in return, the P5+1 agreed to limited sanctions relief for Iran. They agreed not to impose any new sanctions and to allow Iran access to some of its frozen assets overseas. Now, the purpose of this interim agreement was to halt any escalatory moves by both sides while they could negotiate a comprehensive deal. Originally, Iran and the P5+1 hoped to conclude a comprehensive agreement by July 20th. On July 19th, it became clear that they weren't going to get there, and the two sides agreed to extend negotiations until November 24th. November 24th, we ended up in the same position as in July. A significant amount of progress had been made, but there were still a few issues that remained to be resolved. And the parties agreed then to continue negotiations and try and reach an agreement this time within 4 months. So the goal now is to have a political agreement by the end of March, and then use the remaining time through June 30th to work out any technical details. Now, much has been made of the fact that Iran and the P5+1 have failed to reach a comprehensive deal. But it's important to remember the incredible amount of progress that they actually have made thus far on components that will make up the comprehensive agreement. In general, Iran and the P5+1 have come to an agreement on a number of very difficult issues, including modifications for the Iraq reactor. Iran and the P5+1 have agreed in principle that Iran will change the design of the reactor so it produces far less plutonium that can be used for nuclear weapons. That's a significant victory for the P5+1 and really takes the plutonium route to the nuclear weapons kind of out of the question for Iran. Iran has also agreed to increase monitoring and verification measures. Some of these measures will actually be permanent. So even if when the comprehensive agreement ends and Iran is considered sort of a normal member of the international community and the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, these measures will remain in place. And this includes SNAP inspections, meaning that the IAEA can access Iran's nuclear facilities on no notice and can actually access non-nuclear facilities if they have concerns that Iran may have conducted activities that are related to a nuclear program or concerns about possible nuclear weapons-related activities. So that would allow the international community access even to some of Iran's military sites if there were concerns about weapons activities going on there. Iran and the P5+1 have also agreed that the Fordow uranium enrichment plant will be converted likely to a research and development facility. This plant is of particular concern to the United States because of its location. It would make it very difficult to access or to hit in the event of a military strike if Iran decided to use this facility to produce uranium for weapons. And Iran and the P5+1 have also come to sort of an understanding that Iran will complete the investigation, the IAEA's investigation into the possible military dimension, which I will speak more about in just a few minutes. But despite that significant progress, there still are some issues that remain to be resolved. Of particular difficulty is determining the size and scope of Iran's uranium enrichment program. The P5+1 wants to limit Iran's uranium enrichment program to meet sort of the current enrichment needs that Iran has now, which would basically mean providing fuel for the Iraq reactor and Iran's full research reactor. Iran, however, wants to build up a civilian nuclear power program for the reactors that it intends to build in the future. And that would mean dramatically increasing its uranium enrichment over the next 10 to 20 years. The scope and sequence of sanctions relief has also been difficult to reach agreement on. There is some agreement on how to offer relief from U.S. and European Union sanctions, but the sanctions that the UN Security Council has put in place are difficult. Iran wants those sanctions lifted more quickly than the P5+1 is willing to right now. So these two issues will need to be resolved in the next few months to get an agreement. Now, one of the things that a lot of people talk about in relation to Iran's uranium enrichment program is the number of centrifuges. Iran currently has about 20,000 centrifuges installed, about 10,200 of which are operating. And there's a lot of discussion about what is the number of centrifuges that Iran should be allowed to have under a deal. And this number, I think, has become largely symbolic of how people consider the success of an agreement. You know, will Iran be forced to reduce its number of centrifuges? By how much? Will they be allowed to keep all of their operating centrifuges? So the number of centrifuges has become, as I said, quite symbolic. But in and of itself, it does not tell us much about Iran's uranium enrichment program. Getting to the P5+1 goal, which is a 1-year breakout time, meaning that it would take Iran 1 year to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for one bomb, is based on a combination of several factors. It's not just about the number of centrifuges. We can also achieve this 1-year goal by reducing the stockpile of uranium that Iran keeps in gas form, because the gas form is what's further enriched. If Iran converts this to powder or ships it out of the country, that can dramatically increase that breakout timeline. Increased transparency on centrifuge production is also very important. The IAEA has access to Iran's centrifuge production facilities and daily access to the enrichment plants. The international community will know immediately if Iran is deviating from the deal. So when thinking about uranium enrichment in terms of the final agreement, it's important not just to look at the centrifuges, but to think about how this combination of factors really play off of one another to meet that key concern of the P5+1, which is to move Iran much further away from obtaining a nuclear weapon should they ever choose to do so. Now, I want to also say just one quick word about the PMDs, or the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program, because a lot has been made of this issue. Now, the international community largely believes that prior to 2003, Iran had a dedicated nuclear weapons research program, but abandoned it in 2003. Some of the activities, however, may have continued after that, but not as part of a dedicated nuclear weapons program. But Iran has not answered the international community's questions, particularly those of the IAEAs, about these activities in the past. This investigation, however, is separate from Iran's negotiations with the P5+1 and needs to remain separate. So any insistence through congressional legislation that these PMD questions be answered in the event of a final deal will only derail the negotiations and push Iran away from the negotiating table. Iran agreed to answer these questions. They entered into a framework agreement with the IAEA in November 2013. They have provided some information. There's still a great deal more that they need to do. But resolution of all of these issues is not necessary for a good deal. The monitoring and verification can be put into place to ensure that Iran is not pursuing nuclear weapons without these issues being answered in full. And a good deal can also incentivize compliance with the IAEA investigation by offering Iran relief from certain sanctions when the IAEA's investigation is completed. So finally, when we get to an agreement in March, which I believe is certainly likely, I think that both sides are very committed to getting a good deal, and both sides see the advantage of a comprehensive agreement. How do you evaluate if it's a good deal from a proliferation perspective? And I would say that there are really two things you need to look for. First, does it block Iran's plutonium and uranium pathways to the bomb? That means, are there enough limits on the nuclear program to ensure that Iran cannot move towards nuclear weapons without immediate detection? And to ensure that these programs are small enough that they don't constitute a weapons threat. Also, a good deal needs to guard against a covert program. And that's where the monitoring and verification, again, is very key. It's important to make sure that the international community, through the International Atomic Energy Agency, has access to all of Iran's sites and can conduct inspections without notice. And this will ensure, again, sort of Iran's compliance and make sure that materials aren't being diverted to a covert program. And then from the Iranian perspective, a good deal needs to allow Iran to retain a limited civilian nuclear program for peaceful purposes, and it needs to phase out nuclear-related sanctions relief. Because just like we need to sell a good nuclear deal from a proliferation perspective in terms of preventing Iran from moving quickly towards nuclear weapons, Iran also needs to be able to sell this deal domestically, and retaining an infrastructure for a civilian program and being able to demonstrate sanctions relief will be very important from that perspective. So I am going to end there and turn it over to Jamal, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Kelsey. All right, we'll just give Jamal a moment to get set up on his computer.
Okay. So my PowerPoint should be up. I want to just thank WAND and ACA for helping put this together. Thank everybody on the call. So, Kelsey sort of laid out what the negotiations look like, what the technical considerations are. For our purposes, we need to know how to protect these negotiations and what is going to happen here in Washington, D.C. To either enable these negotiations to go forward or for potentially Congress to get in the way, undermine the talks, potentially even pass legislation that could kill the talks. And we know from experience that that latter option is one that is a high likelihood, and only through strong grassroots action can we prevent bad congressional legislation. So first, I just want to look at some key dates. I think Kelsey already covered some of this, but what we're looking at right now, January 2015, the 114th Congress begins. The senators and the members of the House have already been sworn in this week. We now have a balance of 54 Republicans in the Senate, 46 Democrats, and in the House, 246 Republicans, 188 Democrats. The next action of the talks is going to be in a couple weeks. On the 18th is the next meeting of the P5+1 in Iran. And then shortly after that, in February, is the date that folks in Congress who want to end these talks are looking to pass legislation. We then have March as the next key date, which is the soft deadline for the P5+1 and Iran to reach a framework agreement. This is a tentative deadline. It's a soft deadline. It's the goal of the parties to get the basic contours of an agreement by this date, but it's not set in stone. What is set in stone is the July date for the final agreement, for all the agreement to be hammered out, for us to have a deal that we will then have to sell here at home, and which the Iranians will have to sell to their constituencies. So keeping these dates in mind, we have two goals on Capitol Hill, I would say. The first goal is to protect these negotiations from bad legislation, diplomacy-killing legislation. I think a lot of you on the phone are probably folks who were involved in the efforts last year. Remember, in November of 2013, the interim agreement was struck with Iran. It set up a framework for negotiations to continue. On the Iranian side, they agreed to put certain restrictions on their nuclear program. And on our side, the United States and its partners agreed to not impose new sanctions. And what did Congress do immediately after that agreement was struck? They introduced legislation to impose new sanctions. This legislation would have killed the negotiations, and it very nearly succeeded in doing just that, but it was grassroots action that stopped that from happening. And so in this new Congress, with this new deadline for negotiations, we have our work cut out to protect these negotiations through March, potentially all the way through July, and to prevent Congress from passing new legislation that would kill the talks. The second goal is to build congressional support for a prospective final deal. A lot of our action is going to need to focus on blocking bad activities in Congress and neutralizing bad actors, but at the same time, we need to be reaching out to our allies and our prospective allies, those folks who are on the fence, and we need to be developing a key bloc, a key constituency on the Hill that will champion a final agreement. Because even if we manage to succeed in our first goal and prevent the talks from getting derailed by congressional legislation, we're really going to have our work cut out for us come July when there is a deal to have champions on the Hill supporting it, coming out strongly to advocate for it, and blocking bad action then, and ensuring that the deal can be implemented fully, which is eventually going to necessitate Congress lifting sanctions. So right now we need to be educating those folks who are on the fence and getting them on our side and shoring up those who have supported the diplomatic process so far. Looking to the 114th Congress, we know that one of the top priorities, if not, some say it's the top priority, is to take action on Iran. The Senate, for the first time in many years, did not pass Iran legislation last year, thanks to efforts by grassroots and the President and allies of the diplomatic process in the Senate and in the House. But now that Democrats are no longer in the majority in the Senate, you don't have Harry Reid blocking a sanctions vote like he did last year after we marshaled all of that pro-diplomacy activity. Now Republicans hold the gavel, and Mitch McConnell, folks like Mark Kirk, Lindsey Graham, John McCain, they are saying that taking action on Iran, passing legislation, is the #2 priority. What we have heard, those of us reaching out to folks on the Hill, is that the Senate Republicans would like to pass as their first priority the Keystone Pipeline legislation, and then as the second priority move to passing Iran legislation. So there are two prospective bills that are being considered. The first is the so-called Corker bill. This is Bob Corker, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's his bill. He introduced it in the previous Congress. He will likely reintroduce it in this Congress. And what this bill does is it would enable Congress to have a vote on any final deal. So if the talks move forward, if an agreement is brokered, Congress then has basically an expedited procedure whereby a resolution of approval or a resolution of disapproval would be introduced and voted on in a quick manner. And what this resolution would do is, if the deal was disapproved by Congress, then any sanctions relief that was included in the deal in order to implement the United States' side of the bargain would be blocked by Congress. And so, obviously this is problematic. On one hand, Congress argues that they should have a say in this process, and I would agree that Congress should have some level of involvement. But what this bill would do is actually give Congress the authority to kill the agreement and treat the agreement as if it were a treaty, which it's not a treaty. And it's not a treaty for many reasons, but I think one of the primary reasons that the President doesn't want to require a vote on this is that it's going to be really hard to get a majority in Congress to vote in favor of this deal. And so this Corker bill would set up that vote and make it very hard for the United States to implement a deal if this bill is passed. The second measure that is being considered and which will likely be introduced soon is the Menendez-Kirk sanctions bill. Now, this is a repeat of what was introduced in the last Congress, the legislation that was introduced right after the interim agreement was first struck. And what this bill would do is impose trigger sanctions on Iran. Now, trigger sanctions means that the sanctions would not go into effect unless certain actions were taken or certain deadlines were not met. And in the previous version of this bill, it was called a trigger sanctions bill, and Menendez and Kirk both argued that this didn't technically mean that the United States was passing new sanctions. They said the sanctions that they wanted to get passed wouldn't go into effect unless Iran violated the terms of the interim agreement. The problem with that argument was that the bill did not do that. The bill actually established mandates that went well beyond the terms of that agreement, and which likely would have required that the sanctions would go into effect immediately. So this would have been a clear violation of the agreement, because we agreed to not pass new sanctions, and this would immediately trigger new sanctions. The sanctions would go into effect and would violate the deal, likely unraveling the talks and creating a whole host of problems that could very quickly spiral out of control. So for this new Menendez-Kirk sanctions bill, what we're hearing is that some of these concerns about those triggers are being dealt with. That, in order to get Democrats to sign on this bill, because what happened in the last Congress was it was overwhelmingly supported by Republicans. About a dozen Democrats did sign on to it, but a number of them walked it back, and they said, you know what, we signed on to this bill, but we don't want to vote on this. The President came out and said he would veto the bill, and it quickly became a very partisan measure. So for this new Congress, there is an attempt by Menendez and Kirk and some of the interest groups that are supporting this sanctions bill to try to paper over some of those concerns and recruit Democrats to once again support this bill so it can be bipartisan and it can actually get through. We don't know what that's going to look like, but even if that's the case, passing this bill, passing legislation that would put sanctions on the books without necessarily implementing them immediately is going to have a very bad effect. It is going to be a signal to the Iranians that the United States may not be willing to uphold the terms of agreement. I think what the Iranians refer to it as is a violation, if not of the deal technically, but then of the deal in spirit. And the concern is that hardliners in Iran would seize on this action. They would say that the United States was planning to violate the deal, and it's very possible that the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, could pass its own legislation saying if if a deal is not reached, if the United States violates, et cetera, then Iran would begin enriching back up to 20%, possibly even enriching closer to weapons grade, and taking other provocative actions that would be viewed as, counter-escalation by some of the hardliners inside Iran. So we're really, playing with fire with this legislation. The other concern about this bill is that, at least in the previous version, it mandated terms for a final deal, and these were terms that they were unrealistic, they were unnecessary, and it was a way for Menendez and Kirk to basically say no deal would be good enough, and so new sanctions would go into effect regardless of whether a final deal was struck, because that final deal wouldn't meet the terms that Menendez and Kirk had dictated. So that's another big problem with this bill. Now, for these two bills, the Corker bill, the up or down vote bill, would likely go through the Foreign Relations Committee. That's Corker's committee. The ranking member happens to be Menendez. And the sanctions bill, the Menendez-Kirk bill, would go through the Banking Committee, which is led by Shelby as well as Sherrod Brown as the ranking member. And from what we're hearing, the sanctions bill is the much more likely vehicle. I expect both of these to potentially advance in parallel, but what a lot of the big interest groups and what a lot of the hawks in Congress are saying is that they want to do this sanctions bill. And the real key for them is trying to recruit these Democrats so that it can be a bipartisan bill. So let's go over some numbers on how do we stop these bad pieces of legislation, and what are the key numbers we need to be looking at. So the first one is an easy one, 60. 60 is the number of senators who would be needed to support one of these bills in order to pass it. 67 is the number of senators who would need to support one of these bills in order to pass it and block the president from being able to veto it, because we expect that the president would veto any of these bills. If they get to 67, it's veto-proof. Now, here's the problem. 65 is the number of senators that we are worried may sign on to one of these pieces of legislation. These are folks who either supported the Menendez-Kirk sanctions bill last year or who, from their public statements, have indicated that they would support a new sanctions bill. This is made up of 53 Republicans, 12 of them are freshmen, and 13 Democrats, one of whom is a freshman. Now, so we're at 65 potentially. That means only 2 senators would need to join that group in order for it to reach 67 and for the bills to become veto-proof. That being said, on the other side, we have 21 senators who we expect to be allies. These are senators who oppose the Menendez-Kirk sanctions in the last Senate or have issued public statements indicating that they're going to support diplomacy and don't want to see legislative action. That number was actually, it was a bit higher in the previous Congress, but a number of those senators retired. And then the other number is 14. That's the number of senators who have been silent allies. So these are people who did not co-sponsor S-1881. They've given okay statements, but they haven't taken a public position saying, we do not support new legislation, we will oppose new sanctions, or we will oppose the Corker bill. So that adds up to 35. 35 is, it's enough to prevent a veto. It's not enough to prevent a bill from being passed. But let's dive into those numbers because it's not quite as gloomy a picture as this may make it seem. There's a lot of members who actually may be in play. So first, the expected allies. And I'll just put this up so that folks on the phone can take a glance and see who maybe where their senators stand. On this chart, expected allies, we have 2 Republicans, Jeff Flake and Rand Paul. They're the only Republicans who did not support the sanctions bill last Congress. And then we have 19 Democrats. These Democrats, and by the way, the names that are in bold are folks who are up for re-election in 2016, just sort of an important marker for us to keep in mind. So these 19 Democrats did not support S. 1881, and they actually came out and publicly opposed it. They opposed those sanctions last year, and they've indicated that they likely would do the same thing this time around. Our next slide is the swing votes, or what I would call sort of our silent allies. These are senators who did not take a public position necessarily, but did not co-sponsor S. 1881 and have demonstrated that they do support the diplomatic process, and they generally don't support Congress taking bad action. So we have 14 of those. All of them are Democrats. None of them are up for re-election. A number of them are Democrats who I think may be more inclined to come out now and take a more public position because either they have assumed a leadership role or they have gotten through a tough re-election. The next slide are what I will call the vulnerable senators. These are senators who supported S. 1881, but who I think may be held off from supporting sanctions or other bad legislation in this new Congress. You'll note that it does include Bob Corker, who's the chairman of SFRC, who has his own Corker bill. He has said some things that indicate that he may not be too keen on legislation to pass sanctions, and that even with his own legislation, that he is open to formulating it in such a way as to avoid undermining the talks or potentially killing the deal. So I don't hold out any great hope that Bob Corker is going to come to our side and become an ally, but I think he's somebody that is worth reaching out to and who, at least thus far, has indicated that having taken the gavel and become the chairman of SFRC, he wants to take a more thoughtful approach to this issue and is somebody that we should be figuring out if he can be worked with. The other are 12 Democrats, and some of these people are sort of more flexible than others. You'll notice that the last 4 names on this list, Coons, Gillibrand, Manchin, and Peters, Blumenthal, Coons, Gillibrand, and Manchin, they all did support the sanctions last year, but then they, after receiving grassroots pressure, after the president came out with his veto threat, they backed down, and they actually indicated that they would not support the bill coming to a vote. And I think some of the other people on this list may also be flexible in that way and could be held off from taking bad action. Let's go to the final slide. These are the people who we expect to be our opponents, that I don't see us pulling them off and preventing them from signing on to bad legislation. Maybe there's people in here that are willing to come around and do the right thing if they get enough education and outreach, but from my vantage point, if a bill is introduced tomorrow, all of these senators would be signed on to it, almost as a guarantee. And that includes 52 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And actually, sorry, that should be 51 Republicans and 1 Democrat. So, if you live in one of these states, I think it's important to be letting these folks know where you stand and letting them know that there's, consequences to supporting these bad actions. But thus far, I haven't seen any indication that these people would be willing to take a step back and let diplomacy move forward. This is the only camp that I think that's the case for, which means that there are 48 senators who are either vulnerable and could be convinced, are swing votes who are likely on our side but just need a little bit of attention in order to come out publicly and take a strong position, and then the expected allies who I expect to strongly be in our camp and oppose new bad measures. So now that we have an understanding of what these numbers look like and sort of how tight these margins are, here's what I would sort of outline as the path to protecting diplomacy and preventing bad actions from happening. The first step is to hold Democrats off new legislation. With the new sanctions push, we're hearing, like I said, a lot of pressure and outreach to try to convince Democrats that it's okay to sign on to this bill. My concern is that once you get a handful of Democrats, it becomes a bipartisan bill, and you start seeing the vulnerable Democrats and even potentially those silent allies of ours start to get peeled off and start to see the writing on the wall, see this as an inevitable piece of legislation, and soon we see that 67 veto-proof mark become reached because Democrats have been peeled off. So it's very important that some of those really vulnerable Democrats get a lot of love, attention, pressure, education, so that they don't sign on to one of these bad bills. The second item is what we want to do is build this solid block of senators to actively support diplomacy. So again, we need 41 senators to oppose these bills in order to oppose these bills or to hold off from supporting these bills in order for those bills to not pass. So, if this goes to a vote, we need 41 no votes in order to block it from passing. And then we would need 34. If the bill looks like it's going to pass, we would need to at least have 34 to uphold a presidential veto. And as we went through, the numbers are below. 21 allies, 14 swing votes, 13 vulnerable votes. And that's a potential for 48 supporters of diplomacy if we really do our job well. And then, the last thing I would leave you with is just the lessons from last year. S1881, that sanctions bill, it looked like it was about to pass. Within the first 4 weeks, it racked up 59 co-sponsors, and the authors of the bill were saying that they had a list that went into the 70s of senators who supported their bill. But because of grassroots action, because of the phone calls, the letters, the meetings that people held with their senators in their districts and in D.C., the game was changed. It was no longer sanctions are inevitable, but instead, in a lot of these offices, they realized we need to commit due diligence. We need to think long and hard about whether we're going to support this bill because the stakes are very high. Our constituents care very deeply about this. So we really, we managed sort of at the last minute last year to stave off bad action, and I'm very convinced we can do it again. One of the benefits we have is that these offices are now aware of how high the stakes are. They know that they can't sign on to this without getting that pressure, but we're going to be tested. There are going to be, Menendez is going to sign on to this bill. There may be a couple of others who sign on to this bad bill, and we need to make sure that we redouble our efforts and establish a firewall so that we don't see more people sign on to this bill, and then it gets away from us, and before we know it, sanctions are passed, the president can't uphold his veto, and the talks have collapsed. So I leave it to you, and I look forward to talking about potential action items that we can take in the coming weeks and months in order to protect this process.
Thank you so much, Jamal, and also Kelsey, for your presentations. Before we take questions from the audience, I'm going to turn it over to Erica Fine to share a few words with us. Erica?
Great. While I am setting up, I just wanted to remind everybody to ask questions, and you can do so by typing them into the right-hand, the box in the right-hand side of your screen. So that was a great presentation from both Jamal and Kelsey, and I think that leaves us with a lot to talk about and a lot to do. And Jamal's, discussion about what members of Congress we need to really be shoring up leads us into a good discussion of what we can do, or what you can do, the audience can do. So there are a couple of things that you can do. You can join the social media conversation by posting on Facebook and Twitter. And there are some popular hashtags that have been floating around for a while. The hashtag Iran Talks or Let Diplomacy Work. And one of the ways that you can be most effective is by tweeting at members of Congress. So just a couple of people that were discussed by Jamal. Senator Bob Corker and Senator Mark Kirk. Their Twitter handles are below in this sample tweet, and it just encourages them to let diplomacy work. Next up, you could also send a letter to the editor, or you can submit an op-ed piece. And just to make sure, for letters to the editor, try and respond within 24 to 48 hours. And I am more than happy to help anyone on this call to write something or provide talking points. Just give me a call, and my contact information is right here. And then finally, you can sign up to take WAND's action alerts. You can go to our website, wandactioncenter.org, and click the Take Action button. We will actually have something out tomorrow. So for those of you who are not on our mailing list, please check back with us, or we will be able to get them to you if you ask for them by typing it in the chat box or whatever. So just try and stay in touch with us. And now I will turn it over. We'll have a brief question and answer section because we don't have a lot of time before we're going to have to close out the session. But I have a question just to take the prerogative of the moderator right now. So this question is for either one of you, Kelsey or Jamal, but I think there's been a kind of a notion that Iran is a longtime foe of the United States, and why should we trust them, or how can we trust them that they are going to hold good on a comprehensive agreement, or that they are not going to be that they won't covertly be able to build a nuclear weapon, and what's changed that makes us be able to trust them, or do we have to trust them?
Sure, Erica, that's a great question. I actually think that we should not trust Iran to follow through on a nuclear agreement. I think we should put in place the monitoring and verification that provides the international community with transparency to prove that they're following through on a nuclear agreement. There are positive indications that Iran is very serious about fulfilling its obligations under any deal. The fact that Secretary Kerry has said very clearly that the implementation of the Joint Plan of Action, the interim agreement, has gone smoothly, and then that there have been no violations is, I think, an extremely positive point. Again, indicating that Iran is willing to follow through on its obligations. But what is key, what will remain key in that comprehensive deal, like I said, is putting in place those measures so that we can ensure that Iran is following through on its commitments, and that it's not a question of trust. It's a question of monitoring and a question of verification.
Great, thank you so much. Abdi, do we have questions, or?
Sure, we have a few. Our first question is from Louis DuBose. Louis asks, please discuss the broader implications of bringing Iran into the community of nations in both the Near East, and the West.
So I can take this one. For us, for NIAC, we're an Iranian American organization, and a lot of our members are Iranian Americans who came from Iran, and their parents came from Iran, and they're deeply concerned about the human rights situation, about the suffering of Iranians under sanctions, and about Iran's isolation, the people of Iran being isolated. And what we are constantly telling folks is that this is so much bigger than a nuclear deal. This is not just a matter of centrifuges. This is a matter of bringing Iran into the international community, enabling the United States to actually pursue its interests in the region instead of being blocked because of this decades-long conflict with Iran. And for Iranians, this is a matter of not just the number of centrifuges they retain, but really, taking a new direction. Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran, was elected on the promise of re-engaging with the international community, ending Iran's isolation, enabling Iranians to be a part of the global economy and other things like that. So this is the first step towards that. This is the first step in what will hopefully be a new direction. And I think it's going to benefit ordinary Iranians. It's going to benefit hopefully the Iranian economy to enable increased voices that can hold the government accountable and take action on things like human rights and empowering civil society. But also, I think the most sort of blatant example of how the United States' interests converge with those of Iran has been the situation in Iraq regarding ISIS. Iran is really the boots on the ground force that is opposing ISIS and fighting ISIS or supporting the fight against ISIS. And the United States isn't even directly able to coordinate with Iran because of this nuclear standoff. We see these examples repeatedly just in the past 10 years. In Afghanistan, it was Iran that was one of the key actors in toppling the Taliban initially and trying to support a democratic process in Afghanistan. And that, as we know, fell apart for many reasons, but one of those reasons was that Iran and the U.S. had a falling out over other issues and stopped coordinating and collaborating and talking and things like that. So, I think that this could have a real impact on just enabling the United States to pursue its interests in the Middle East that overlap with Iran's and which have overlapped with Iran's for a long time, but which we haven't been able to actually pursue because of these other issues.
Thank you very much. Actually, our next question was about how this negotiation and relationship with Iran affects our battle with ISIS. So thank you for going ahead and tackling that. Our next question is from Robert Naiman, and Robert asks, which Senate Democrats spoke up for the interim deal a year ago, but haven't yet, since the November deadline, spoken up for extending the talks and extending the interim deal and opposing new sanctions now?
So, thank you, Robert. I have a list right here. We have Maria Cantwell, Tom Carper, Dick Durbin, Heinrich, Leahy, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson, Harry Reid, Elizabeth Warren, Ron Wyden, Bernie Sanders, and Jeff Flake. Those are all folks who came out in support of the interim agreement, but according to my records have not come out opposed to new sanctions or who have not even expressed any opinion one way or the other about the extension. And I think it's a good question because those are the low-hanging fruit. We need to make sure to keep them on our side and that they're taking positive actions.
Great, thank you. Our next question, if the deal falls apart due to congressional sanctions, how could this affect broader nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament efforts?
I think that it would be a huge blow to the nuclear nonproliferation regime if we fail to get an agreement with Iran, because if the deal falls apart due to congressional action, it could lead Iran to escalate on its own, to return to enriching to 20% uranium, to 20% enrichment, to operating more centrifuges, to working on advanced centrifuges. And these are all actions that elements of the Iranian government have said Iran would take if Congress passes more sanctions and the deal falls apart. And this then, could potentially lead to a military strike either by Israel or the United States or both countries. And in that case, I think it would be very likely that Iran could then actually openly pursue nuclear weapons and pull out of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and pursue weapons openly to prevent any such attacks like that from occurring again in the future. That is, of course, a more extreme scenario, but less extreme but equally a concern is that failing to resolve this issue gives us gives Iran the ability to continue operating some of the illicit networks that it has developed so that it can build its nuclear program despite sanctions. A comprehensive deal will close a lot of those illicit networks, but keeping those open, moves nuclear-related materials and technology through illicit channels that non-state actors sometimes have access to. So it is a serious concern, and I think that is why both sides are very committed to getting a deal, because everyone wins with a good agreement, but both sides certainly lose if the talks fall apart.
Jamal, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, I think that was a pretty comprehensive answer.
All right. All right, I think we have time for one last question. So a lot of times when these issues are brought up on social media, people tend to talk about Israel. So how do we help keep the conversation on track, and are there any messaging or talking points that we can use to keep the conversation focused on social media?
I'm not a social media guru. Go ahead, Kelsey.
Oh, I was just going to say, from a non-proliferation and disarmament perspective, I think it's important to emphasize that the entire region is more stable with an Iranian nuclear deal. And a good deal gives the international community, keeps the international community's eyes on Iran's nuclear program and ensures that there are no covert nuclear activities going on. And I think that benefits Israel's security. So I think reminding the region, reminding the entire international community that there's a global benefit to this deal is certainly important.
Yeah, it's very difficult to avoid this conversation, but the dirty little secret is that this deal will be good for Israel. It will be good for the actual objective of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It may not be good for trying to keep Iran isolated, marginalized, for keeping the conversation off of the very serious problems in the region, whether they're in Israel's backyard or in Iraq and Syria. It'll actually enable us to start resolving some of those issues, and with Iran in the fold, I think that this diplomatic solution can enable a lot of other diplomatic solutions. It can enable, if done wisely, it can enable some rapprochement between Iran and other parties in the region, whether that's Saudi Arabia and even Israel. But this is the starting point, and often making big changes has to start somewhere, and this is the hinge for those big changes. So maybe it doesn't serve the immediate political goals of some Israeli politicians, but this deal will benefit everybody in the region who wants stability and security and peace. And it may be tough now to get it over the hump, but once we get it there, we're going to have a lot of opportunities to resolve a lot of these outstanding issues that have haunted the region for so long.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kelsey and Jamal, for your excellent presentations and the very helpful information. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. And thank you to everyone on the phone and on their computers who joined the webinar. Please be on the lookout for some follow-up materials that we'll email to you. And please take a few minutes to fill out the follow-up survey that will show up when you exit the webinar. We really welcome your feedback, and we use it as we build our webinar program for 2015. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good afternoon.